How is everyone? So since we will be at home for the year in some capacity, it is important that you learn how to paint indoors at home. No. How is everyone? How is everyone? Since we will be at home in some capacity for the duration of the year, it is important that you learn how to paint while you are at home. So in this case, we are going to venture into a basement where it won't really matter if anything goes wrong in terms of a paint spill. So let's go. Okay, so here we are in the inkwell, as I call it. I'm going to go over a few essentials that you will need for painting at home and some practices to ensure the safety of yourself and your family and the general community in terms of what to do with your paint water. So, in just looking around at what I have here, first I've got this little rolling cart. You can see the watercolor palette that I use stored upon. There's a spray water bottle here that I use to activate the palette. I don't typically have time to take my watercolor brush and splash it over each color as we often do in class. So these are about $1.75. They're very handy to have. You could just spritz your watercolor palette to activate it. Clearly this is much larger than the watercolor palettes you will be issued in class, but this might be worth investing in if you're really interested in watercolor. Paint water storage. I tend to use a lot of these glass jars, and they're great because I know that they're not going to tip over. Certainly one that is too tall, that would be a tipping hazard, but I like these shorter to the ground ones. There's less peril there. It doesn't really matter what you're using. So essentially what you do is you would add water to your jar, you would rinse your brushes in there, and then at the end of the day you would pour your water out into another container, and in this container all of your water will eventually evaporate and you will just be left with the sediment at the bottom. When you're using watercolor, all you need to do is rinse the brush with clean water and then it's ready to be stored. You should never at any point put any of your paint water down the sink, and you certainly shouldn't put paint down the sink. Latex and acrylic, those are going to clog your pipes and be very bad for the environment. Typically, I use a 5-gallon bucket and I dump all of my paint water in that. It's out of the way, it frees up my glass jars, and then, as I said, the sediment of the paint sets to the bottom and coats the bottom of the barrel, and the water evaporates. What I didn't realize when I just emptied this jar into the bucket ahead of filming this was that there was a crack in the bottom of the 5-gallon bucket, and all of the paint water seeped out all over the floor. That bucket is now in the trash. If you don't have glass jars, if you don't eat pickles, I guess, you can use water jugs, cut the top off, they have a handle, and you can use that as a paint water container as well. Whatever works for you. This is an Arches watercolor block. This is cold press. It's a 9x12 size. They come in much larger sizes as well. This is a hot press one, so hot and cold. Once you finish up the watercolor paper in here, I like to save them because the block at the bottom, like this, it's like this thick cardboard. Then that can become an oil palette or an acrylic palette. It's a hard top surface, and if I take a sheet of wax paper and I line the bottom and I tape a perimeter around so that the wax paper is fastened onto the board, now I have a nice portable hard surface. Now when you're in college or if you're a professional painter, you can end up purchasing a large piece of glass to use as your palette, but if you're on a budget, these work fantastic. The other thing I like to use if I'm doing oil paint, the iced Starbucks coffees, they come with these lids. They have a tiny inner circle there, so I find that this is great if I'm going to be working with traditional oil, if I'm using linseed oil or something, or if I'm using water-based oil. Just gluing this to the corner of my palette and then having not only my oil set up here but also my little bit of water that I need to dip into is very convenient. When you're at home, you should also have a painting rag. That can either be an old hand towel or an old t-shirt, and something to just keep at the corner and to rinse your brush, clean your brush off as necessary. Using paper towels, especially during this pandemic when there is a shortage, they're not all that practical. Paper towels do serve their purpose in terms of maybe cleaning out any extra sediment at the bottom of your jar, but more or less, especially if you're using watercolor, a rag is going to be much more efficient because it will be more absorbent. The paper towels will just end up as a sopping mess on your table. Typically, if you're left-handed, you would have all of your supplies to your left. If you're right-handed, you would have your supplies to your right. I am right-handed, which is why my watercolor palette and my little station here is off to the right. That way, the reason is, when you're painting, you can dip into the water, dip into your palette, and then come over to your paint. If you always have to, let's say I have all my materials on the left, if I'm crossing in front, there's more of a clumsiness to that. It's not a second nature gesture, but also I could increase the odds of a paint spill. Whether if I'm using pen and ink, that could be even worse, because nothing ruins a day like a spilled jar of ink. Do not sleep in the same room where you paint. If you're in college, or when you're in college, if you happen to be an art major, there's unfortunately nothing you can do to avoid that situation. Of course, I myself spent 4 years in college sleeping in the same room as my paint materials. You can't avoid it. But if you were to go online and read the literature that the manufacturer puts out on safe practices and handling, all the manufacturers will include a disclaimer that you should never sleep in the same room as your art materials are stored. And the reason for that is that whether you realize it or not during the day, they are emitting an odor, and you do not want to be breathing that in for 6 to 8 hours or 6 to 10 hours while you're asleep. It is not healthy for you. Acrylic especially has a very pungent odor, and certainly oil, but even watercolor is something that you want to take great care in. I realize that in these circumstances there may be a difficulty in getting your hands on, no pun intended, rubber gloves, but when you are painting, you should wear a rubber glove on your painting hand at least. You do not want paint to get onto your skin, because your skin is porous and the paint will then be able to seep into your bloodstream. If you're going to be painting for the long term, you want to make sure that you are ensuring your long-term health and safety. So a box of disposable rubber gloves is essential. Do not eat and do not drink around your paint, because you do not want to accidentally consume any of the paint. Certainly if you have any pets, they must not have access to any of your paint and materials. So take the necessary precautions to keep yourself and your loved ones safe.